A live look at the United States Supreme Court, which has struck down some of Donald Trump's sweeping tariffs. In a ruling released this morning, the court says the law Donald Trump used, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, also known as IEPA, cannot be applied to tariffs. Let's bring in CTV News U.S. political analyst Eric Ham. Eric, thank you very much for being here. What could this possibly mean for Canada? Is it clear at this point?
Oh, this is seismic because the tariffs that the president has used specifically on issues surrounding fentanyl, those tariffs now actually come off the table. Donald Trump cannot implement tariffs on Canadian goods as a result of this fentanyl. So those tariffs will actually be struck down. Now, tariffs surrounding aluminum, copper, and steel, those tariffs are actually allowed to stay in place. But nevertheless, this is a ruling that many thought would actually come down against the White House. It does make it very difficult for Donald Trump to implement what has been his signature economic plan, to implement tariffs on countries all across the world. And so what we're seeing now is this could actually neuter the president, not to mention many of the threats that we have seen from Donald Trump, particularly as it relates to Canada. Now, we do know also a number of companies have already begun suing for billions in return because these tariffs they believe have been illegal. The Supreme Court did not actually touch that issue, but given the fact that they have ruled against the president, we can expect that many companies as well as countries will continue to actually try to actually have those funds actually refunded to them. We do know that Justice Kavanaugh, who was actually one of the dissenters in this ruling, did actually touch on that issue, saying that if, in fact, this were to go through where Trump's tariffs were deemed unconstitutional, how, in fact, would the U.S. Treasury actually refund that money? They did not actually offer a blueprint on how to do that, but nevertheless, this is now going to be another issue that the courts may actually have to take up.
Wow, this really opens a can of worms. What kind of response are you expecting to hear from Trump himself?
I think the president will, of course, rail against the Supreme Court's decision. But we also know that the Trump administration was planning contingencies, recognizing that, in fact, the Supreme Court could rule against them on this issue. And so we do know that there are other avenues that the president has available to him should he decide that he wants to keep these tariffs in place. But also, this could set up an even greater battle between the Congress and the White House as well, because we know that right now there was a resolution that passed the House repealing those tariffs against Canada specifically. That resolution is now in the Senate. We do know that there were a number of Republicans that joined that resolution in the Senate. Now that this ruling has come down from the Supreme Court, we could actually see more Republicans actually join that resolution, and that could make it potentially a veto-proof piece of legislation that could pass both chambers and go to the president's desk. Of course, that might be getting a little ahead of our skis in terms of what Congress may do, but now what we're seeing here is Donald Trump has been severely weakened on this tariff fight.
What are the political implications of all of this for Trump?
Yeah, there have been the president has been, his approval rating has been precipitously declining. And of course, one of the reasons for that is because Americans are continuing to confront high prices on a number of goods. And of course, a lot of that comes from these tariffs that the president has implemented. But now many of these tariffs could begin to go away. And while that would be a boon for many Americans, if the president continues to try to find ways to keep these tariffs in place, we could see politically both the president as well as his party continue to lose favor, which is not a good place where they want to be, particularly in a midterm election year where already we're beginning to see Republicans are losing ground to Democrats. And now the threat of losing both chambers of Congress is certainly in play.
Very interesting. I'm just wondering about what kind of mess this could all make when you talk about those refunds and unclear what is going to happen for all of that, Eric.
Well, I think because the Supreme Court did not take this issue up, and it's very shocking that they did not actually touch on this, because we know that given the fact that this is a 6-3 ruling, you had Justice Roberts, who was joined by 2 other conservatives on the court, actually siding with liberals on this issue. So this issue is now actually it's clearly and unequivocally decided. The fact that they did not actually take this issue up and actually go that additional step to actually award these refunds and was actually pretty confusing, because now we know the president or the White House is going to actually fight against returning any money from the Treasury as a result of this ruling. So this is going to be another fight that will certainly go to the courts, and the courts are going to have to adjudicate this. So the fact that they did not do it now, it's just inexplicable, because now it just means more fight for the president and an even bigger headache for him, particularly in the courts, to say nothing of what it means for him politically, where we're seeing the president now being rebuked by the Congress on these tariffs, and now another massive rebuke by the courts as well.
It feels sometimes like Trump always finds a way to maneuver himself out of these kind of situations. Do you see him pulling any kind of maneuver here?
I'm sure that right now the White House is looking at any number of executive options that he has available to him to try to keep these tariffs in place. President Donald Trump certainly is not going to simply walk away quietly. That's just not who he is. And because this has been the cornerstone of his economic and trade policies to be able to implement these tariffs. And we know that has been certainly a vehicle that he has used to try to court and gain leverage heading into these USMCA negotiations. But now the president has been completely stripped of this. And so I suspect that the administration will look for potential avenues and venues where they can try to implement these tariffs. But nevertheless, they are deeply, deeply unpopular with Americans. They create greater unpredictability for companies and corporations. And so it would be good if the president could move away from this, at least perhaps politically, but nevertheless, that's just not who Donald Trump is.
You mentioned the upcoming USMCA negotiations. How will this impact those? Does it give Canada leverage?
I think where Canada actually is hoping to gain leverage is with the Congress. As we have already seen, the temperature right now is moving in a direction where you have Republicans who simply are no longer wanting to see these tariffs implemented on, and have also made clear that they believe that USMCA is in fact a very effective trade pact between the United States and Canada, and they want to actually keep this in place. And so because Congress actually ratified the agreement back in 2018, they are certainly going to have a role to play in how it goes, and if the United States exit the agreement, or if in fact the United States stays in. And so I think what we're seeing here is that much now depends on actually what the president can do to sway Congress to his side, because right now what we're seeing here is the president has lost a key component in order to be able to continue to suggest that he will exit the agreement, now that we see that Congress simply does not want to see negotiate or trade or tariffs on Canada at this point.
All right, and we are getting some reaction to this on this side of the border. Canada-U.S. Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc responding on social media, Eric, and I'm just going to read you his response and have you react to it. So Dominic LeBlanc saying the United States Supreme Court's decision reinforces Canada's position that the IEEPA tariffs imposed by the United States are unjustified. And it goes on to say, well, Canada has the best trade trade deal with the United States of any trading partner, we recognize that critical work lies ahead to support Canadian businesses and workers who remain affected by Section 232 tariffs on steel, aluminum, and automotive sectors. What do you think of that, Eric?
Yeah, that's right. They did not remove, they allowed the tariffs on steel, aluminum, copper, things like that to actually stay in place. So those are still going to be impactful. However, for the president right now, it is actually going back to the drawing board. But again, Congress is also watching this. And given the fact that we have seen the president attempting now in very desperate ways to try to keep the pressure on Canada. We know there has been issues surrounding dairy products that the president has certainly talked about. But again, the Gordie Howe Bridge. But this ruling by the courts, combined with House Joint Resolution 72 to repeal tariffs on Canada that passed the House last week, that is expected to move through the Senate when they return from their recess next week. This is just another issue where we're seeing a number of blows on the president's policies. And of course, he certainly has opportunities available to him to try to keep these tariffs in place. It's just going to be very difficult for him, to say nothing politically of what this means, because what we're seeing here is this is also making clear that there are growing cracks in Donald Trump's base. And I think this gives the Canadian negotiators time, because what they're hoping for, I'm sure at this point, is for a change in the guard in Congress with these midterm elections, because certainly if Democrats control both chambers, because CUSMA was negotiated and ratified by the Congress, it will require Congress to actually rescind all of those laws that made CUSMA the law of the land in the United States. And we know Democrats certainly are not going to support that. And so this gives negotiators an enormous amount of time. And I think that's what they're buying for, because certainly President Donald Trump, as well as his team, are now going to be focused on what they can do and how they can try to keep these tariffs in play for the foreseeable future.
And as he mentioned, Eric, this does not include those tariffs on steel and aluminum from Canada. Does this in any way set up those tariffs being removed?
No, not at all. And in fact, Donald Trump will certainly keep those in place. I think what we're seeing here right now is, I think the next fight will be on Treasury refunds and what that battle will look like, and how the president will attempt to try to take that on. We know next week is a major week for President Donald Trump. The State of the Union is taking place on Tuesday. And so given that we just got this ruling today, I suspect over the weekend, Donald Trump's speechwriters are going to be working feverishly to try to address this issue, because this is a massive, massive loss for the president, and this is something that's going to reverberate outside of Washington. So everyday Americans are going to be looking at this ruling and how it is going to impact them. Donald Trump is certainly going to want to talk about this, especially when he has a captive audience and nation watching. And so I suspect we will get some idea from the president on what the next steps will be when he addresses the country and the Congress next week during his State of the Union.
All right. And once again, for anyone just joining us, the U.S. Supreme Court has ruled that the law Donald Trump used to impose certain tariffs on Canada cannot be applied to tariffs. We're going to continue to follow this breaking news. Eric, thank you very much for being here with us.
Thank you.
Take care.